Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LEC Summer Split 2025 Primer and Power Rankings video. It's finally time to get into some LEC action. We've done this for every other region that we cover already, the LEC taking the most amount of time to get back into the swing of things, but it kind of makes a lot of sense. Honestly, most regions should have probably been on this schedule anyways, where they gave their teams a little bit of time to recover from international breaks. Unfortunately, for the LEC, they were the region that probably needed the least amount of time to recover from the international breaks. Jokes aside, I think this is a much stronger region heading into summer. We expect a lot of growth from these teams with a lot of young players anyways, and I think a lot of the middle tier teams are getting better, or at least trying to push for the top of the standings. I'm excited to talk about things. I hope you are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. As per usual, these are some of the biggest videos that we make across the entire year. Not only in terms of just, sheer hours and sheer length, but like the setup for this, we go and rewatch tape, not only for all the new players that are coming into the league, but I go and rewatch tape on every single player that I'm going to talk about, just to make sure that my opinion is founded in something. Of course, we've covered every single game in the LEC over the last 4 years, and so I have a pretty good idea where a lot of these players end up landing, but certainly something worth noting. If you are new to the channel, what this video is essentially going to be, we're going to be going from number 10 to number 1 in my power rankings, talking about every single team, their floor, their ceiling, playstyle expectations, player expectations, all of that stuff. We'll be ranking, like I said, every team from 1 to 10. We will also be ranking every player within their position from number 1 to number 10. A couple of caveats that come alongside that and come alongside the video in the first place. First and foremost, the biggest one. This is just my opinion. You are going to disagree with me. I'm letting you know that right now. There is going to be something in this video that you find to be completely egregious and just completely incorrect. That's totally fine. That's the point of making opinion-based videos. Let me know in the comments what you agree or disagree with. I'm happy to hear you guys' feedback, and let me know where I'm kind of off base on public consensus. I'm not scared of being against public consensus. I'm going to share my opinion basically no matter what, but it is always good to kind of know where I'm in the minority versus where I think a lot of people are, alongside me in terms of my opinions. Definitely curious to learn that, but alongside that as well, note that this rating scale that I have, the number system, it's super flexible. It's very difficult to nail down, okay, well, this guy's definitely the 6th best jungler, and this guy's definitely the 7th best jungler. Like, that, that kind of difference is just not really that ginormous in terms of how things end up going. If a player is 1 or 2 positions off of where you have them, we're probably pretty close on where our analysis is at. I'll talk about where I think there are breakpoints, and alongside that, I think the other big one, not every position is created equal, especially here in the LEC. There are some positions that have quite a lot of talent. There are so many good supports right now in the LEC, especially at the top end level, that the 4th best support might be the best AD carry in terms of just how good that position is right now. But you don't have that same kind of depth for every position. Once you get past the top 5 junglers in the LEC, it's a complete crapshoot. Number 6 to number 10, like whatever order you want, man. Genuinely, none of them have proven anything. So if that gives you some sort of context, not every number is created equal. Just because you see 2 players with, they're both 6th in their position, that doesn't mean I think they're the same caliber of player, and we'll talk about that as we continue to go along. But those are the major caveats. Those are the major things to watch out for. I hope you guys are excited. I know I am. I'm always excited to do these videos. So without further ado, let's kick things off with number 10 in my power rankings, the team I have last. And honestly, this should be no surprise to anybody who's either followed the LEC, followed what's been going on in the offseason, or even really just followed my channel over the course of this year, because coming in at number 10 for me, it is going to be SK Gaming. I mean, come on, like, how do you possibly put anyone else at number 10 right now? This team is in complete flux. It feels like they've given up their entire present to try and see what their future was, or at least that's what the idea was going into Spring Split when you brought in Bukata and Kadui. It's like, okay, you're replacing Rahel, who's probably your best player, which is never a great idea, and then Isma, who at least has experience at this level, for players who are completely unproven and you're hoping you're going to be able to get the best out of them. But I understand bringing in young talent, kind of punting on a year you already see yourself as bad, and then seeing what you have going into 2026. Well, now you've sold Bukata after 1 split. You brought in a bunch of veterans to replace a lot of the players that are outgoing on this team, and I genuinely just have no direction as to what's going on. My only hypothesis has to be that SK is trying to assemble the cheapest team that has ever been assembled in the LEC, and they might have been successful, but Let's go ahead and talk about it. First off, let's talk about what you're seeing on your screen very quickly. Of course, the team name in the top left corner, the number that is next to the team, in this case, number 10, is where I power rank them from number 1 to number 10. In parentheses, that's going to be how that has changed from the spring primer to now. Not the end of spring split, rather the beginning of spring split. I think that's a more accurate way to compare how these teams are moving because, you know, I think it's more fair to say that a lot of the end of spring kind of thoughts and opinions on these teams are probably just going to carry over. And so there wouldn't be as many changes if I did it from the end of spring. You can see how they ended up finishing in spring split, their record and their placement, and then what group they're in the summer split. I guess I should probably talk about the format at least a little bit here. Of course, if you are new to the LEC and you maybe aren't as familiar with the format going in, every team has been separated into 2 groups of 5. So every team is going to play each other in a best of 3 single round robin stage. So you'll get 4 best of 3s in the regular season. If you are bottom 1 in your group during that process, so the bottom 2 teams, you are eliminated. Everyone else ends up making a playoff style bracket. Top 2 in the group end up getting a bit of an upper bracket advantage. Bottom 2, or I guess 3rd and 4th in the group, does not get that same kind of advantage. Honestly, with all of the crazy formats going on globally right now where everything is getting so overcomplicated, this is pretty straightforward and pretty easy to kind of understand. So I do appreciate the simplicity here from the LEC, and hopefully this is a fun format to watch. I don't always love breaking up, you know, teams into groups, but at the end of the day, at least the groups are balanced in terms of how they finished in the previous splits. You can then see every single player that's going to be starting for the team across the line, their name, any asterisk next to the player's name will just denote that they are taking up an import slot, and then the big one, the ranking for each player below that, 9, 10, 1, whatever. That's going to be where I personally rank them within their own position. Again, in parentheses, just how that has changed from the spring primer to now, and that's for the team. That's not specifically for the player. If a player swapped teams in terms of where they're at, I'm not going to show their grade. I'm going to show where the team's grade was at going into spring, because I think that's a more accurate understanding of whether or not the team itself got better or worse in the position from what I was expecting. New obviously just denotes that the player is coming in to replace somebody else, and that's what you're seeing on the screen. That with all that out of the way, though, we finally got our preamble done. Let's specifically talk about SK Gaming. Their lineup is looking like Dindin in the top lane, Skeens in the jungle, Abadaga in the mid lane, Kadui at AD carry, and Loopy at support. Some pluses and minuses for SK, at least in terms of upside, but definitely mostly minuses. I'm really out on this team. I think their offseason was one of the worst I've ever seen, especially for a Western organization. You know, you expect bottom tier LCK teams to make bad decisions because they've been doing so for so many years, but you don't really expect LEC teams to just bring on players who have been underperforming so consistently in multiple different levels that you would expect to be, worse than the LEC. And it's weird to talk about. We can talk about the players that are staying because I think there's a big conversation on that. First, the one player that I actually have some excitement over, Kadui, is still on this team. I feel really bad for him. He came into a roster where he's like, okay, I'm kind of joining up with some former teammates here in Genax and Reeker and hoping to be able to build something together to move forward with. They're both immediately gone by the summer split. He's the only member with any sort of inexperience remaining and upside, in my opinion, remaining on this roster, and he's just kind of doomed. I think he had some pluses and minuses in the spring split. Was he a perfect player? Absolutely not, but he was also playing for a pretty terrible team, and he has the worst player in the entire league as his support, although his new mid laner is probably going to give him a run for his money in that regard, so we will talk about it. But Kadui is at least interesting. He is an AD carry that I think theoretically could be a number 1 option for a bad team in the LEC. Maybe he grows into something more. This is not the circumstance that I think is going to make that easier, though. He's surrounded by some of the worst players in the entire league, and that really is highlighted by Loopy, who's the only player who will be on SK Gaming for the entirety of 2025. Absolutely ridiculous. He's the worst player in the entire league. This guy is unplayably bad. He does nothing at an even below average level. Like, he is actually just poor to bad at every part of the game, at least in terms of what we've seen. They ended up bringing him in because he had that previous synergy with Rahel when they were in the Damwon system on Damwon Challengers, D plus Kia Challengers, as a bot lane together. Rahel is almost immediately replaced by Kadui, and we're like, okay, well, what's the point of keeping Loopy? He was already terrible even with Rahel, and he wasn't very good last year as well. I want to remind people, he was playing in Latin America last year and was, I would say, a top 6 support in Latin America. Like, certainly not someone that was, like, breaking the game or anything like that. He was a lower mid-table support in Latin America, which is never a great sign. time, but then he comes back for spring. He no longer has that connection with Rahel, and he's even worse. He's absolutely unplayable over the course of the past split. It doesn't matter. It's on engagers, it's on playmakers, it's on enchanters. It does not matter the kind of position that you want to put him in. He's never going to be successful in that role. I've given up on him completely. The fact that he is still on this team must mean that he is getting paid so much that they just cannot buy him out, because it's completely, I just can't understand. I genuinely do not understand why he's still playing here. All due respect to Loopy, he's taking up an import slot, and he's the worst player in the league. So, you know, as much as I like Kadui, I think the spot lane will still be bottom 1 in the LEC, and it certainly isn't fixed by the top side of the map. I will promise that. We'll start with the positive one, and that's potentially Din Din coming in on the top side. I'm not a big fan of him. You know, I talked about him a lot when we were covering the LCK last year when he was playing for Nongshim. I was constantly calling for this guy to get benched because he just wasn't very good in the LCK. There have been a lot of players in that similar situation that have made things work elsewhere in terms of just how they're set up. Obviously, Jun is probably the best example of that here in the LEC, but Din Din doesn't necessarily have the playmaking instincts of someone like that. I think his LCK Challengers League tape does inspire some confidence, and his tape in the TCL is not nearly as bad as another teammate who played in the TCL this past split, but it certainly wasn't like super encouraging. He was playing a lot of carries, and the team was just generally okay playing around him. I think there's maybe something here, if only because even bad Koreans typically do well in the LEC. You have to imagine there's at least a minuscule amount of upside, but I don't think the team around him is in a good spot to be able to push that forward. And if he's going to be isolated a lot on the top side, I can see teams kind of targeting him in terms of how things go, because he does like to play those more aggressive picks. Things like Jace and Gwen are definitely going to be on the docket for Din Din. You know, Jace was definitely a signature pick for a long time. And then the mid-jungle duo, which is not just the worst in the league, it's by far the worst in the league. Skeens is coming up from the TCL as well over in Turkey alongside Din Din. Different teams, but same, I guess, league having being played in the spring split. The difference is Skeens was horrible in the TCL. I think there's actually a genuine argument that he was the worst jungler in the entire league, and for that guy to get promoted to the LEC is questionable, to say the least. I certainly don't see any of what SK is seeing right now. He was okay in NNO. Like, I think that is something to at least kind of hold your hat on, but like that is really kind of reaching in terms of just, well, what are we expecting to get out of this guy in the jungle? Obviously, he's played in the LEC before. He's had experience being near the top of tier 2 before, but it's been a long time. It's been a couple of years since he was actually like a relevant LEC caliber jungler, and there's absolutely nothing in 2025 to prove that is going to be the case. He likes to play early skirmishers, things like Vi, Xin Zhao. You know, he doesn't want to play slow. He wants to play fast. The problem is he's been consistently getting exploited in that regard because he's not a very good skirmisher. So if he plays the way he did earlier this year in the spring split in the TCL, like, this is a completely doomed signing. There's absolutely nothing to gain out of it because, like I said, he was bottom 1 in a tier 2 league, which is just not a good sign for tier 1. And then there's Abadaga, who is coming back from North America, having played there throughout both winter and spring, and there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. This guy was the single worst player in North America in 2025 so far. He was completely unplayable for Disguise. He was constantly losing by 200, 300 gold throughout every single game. He was down 50 CS every single game. His team fighting, while inconsistent in the sense that there were times where he was doing all right, was 90% of the time terrible. There were no encouraging traits from Abadaga so far this year in 2025. I didn't expect that. That's really the only thing you can hang your hat on here. It's just that is a little bit of an outlier for what maybe I could have anticipated after last year being on K Corp Blue. Like, I maybe expected Abadaga to be a little bit better in terms of what he was, but the reality of the situation is that he went over to, you know, a Disguise team that really needed him to stabilize in the mid lane and lost them game after game after game by being overly aggressive and having basically no hands to follow up with any of the plays that he's going to go for. If those are the versions of Abadaga and Skeens that you are getting here on SK, this might be the worst mid-jungle duo in a tier 1 region that we have watched in many years, because the most recent tape on both of these players is like tier 3 level, and that's just completely unacceptable for both of them. Hopefully they end up figuring things out, but it's impossible for me to rank them both above last place in their positions with just how bad they've looked in their recent stops. And that goes to show, like, Loopy's already the worst player in the league. You add maybe the worst jungle mid duo that you could have gotten, at least from a realistic perspective, on top of that, and you're like, okay, well, Kadui, is he the player that's going to save this? Din Din, is he the player that's going to save this? No, like, there's nobody on this team that I feel good enough about to be like, well, at least you have this. It's just the 3 worst players in the league in terms of my expectation, and then some players that maybe could be all right. Yeah, this is the 10th place team, and until proven otherwise, I might expect them to go winless. Then moving on to number 9 in my power rankings, and I don't know if this one's going to be controversial. I imagine some people are going to say I'm much too low on this team, but coming in at number 9 for me, it is going to be Navi here coming in, and obviously they're the new roster, they're the new team joining the LEC in the summer split. They are replacing Rogue. They bought the spot from Rogue, as we all kind of expected them to at some point throughout this year. I expected it to be the case going into 2026, but at the very least, it looks like they got the deal done early, and because of that, they obviously had to rush to find a roster that could make sense for them. You know, with so little time, with so many players still under contract, they're likely going to push for a lot more going into 2026, but for now, I don't know, man. I'm just not a fan of this roster. I don't think that they're going to be particularly successful, and I think there is a clear bottom 2 in the LEC. I think Rogue was a team that was bad and had a lot of problems. 10th place, obviously, like, they were an issue, but like, there is a chance that they had a higher floor than a team like Navi does here in terms of how they've, you know, constructed their roster, and that might be controversial because, again, I know I'm a bit lower on some of these players. Let's go ahead and go over it. Their lineup is looking like Adam in the top lane, Thager in the jungle, Larson in the mid lane, Han, Sam, D at AD carry, and Malrang at support. There are some really interesting pieces here when it comes to what Navi is putting together, because it's clear that they want to play for 2026, and I don't say that just in a ubiquitous, like, oh, maybe they want to, you know, wait and save their money sense, but rather they've already signed Rylek, who had some visa issues, so he wasn't going to be here for 2025, but they were so confident they wanted him as their starting jungler going into next year that they've signed him already, and he's just going to be waiting out the rest of 2025, and he will be coming in as the starting jungler in 2026. So that's how I know that this team does not care about the end of this year, and quite frankly, I think this lineup does show it, because while you do have 2 new players coming up from multiple different sources, I don't really feel like either of them are game changers, and I'll kind of talk about that as we continue to go along. The one big piece that you were able to retain here that was a must keep from Rogue was Adam on the top side, who I continue to believe is a top 3 top laner, and that's going to piss off Fnatic fans. Spoiler alert later on in the video, but Adam is incredibly talented. He is a ridiculously good top laner. He always looks good, regardless of how well the rest of his team is doing. He seems to be pretty ubiquitous in terms of the fact that he doesn't need other people to succeed in order for him to win in lane and to generate resources for himself, which is a big plus. I think a lot of players sometimes do need a good surrounding core in order to be useful. Now, do I think he can carry games for bad teams, you know, entirely? No. Like, we saw that with Rogue. He can't 1v9 in that kind of sense, but nobody really can do that. Adam is just one of those players where if there were no off-the-rift issues, if you had never heard of any problems, if he hadn't consistently been getting into trouble on multiple teams that he had been a part of, like, there's no reason for him not to be going to Worlds every single year. That's the kind of talent that Adam has, and he consistently shows it, again, even on bad teams. And so I felt like it was a must-keep here from Rogue. He's been very good at the start of this year. I really have no qualms or concerns with him on the top side. I believe a lot of teams would benefit, a lot of better teams would benefit from having a player like Adam on their roster, but he's not the only player that this team is retaining. In fact, they're bringing back 3 players from that Rogue roster in some way, shape, or form. Larson, the other one, staying within his own role, obviously coming back in the mid lane. The Rogue franchise player, if you want to call him that, coming over to Navi to kind of carry that legacy on. Larson is not what he was, and I think everyone kind of knows that at this point. He's just too slow for the modern game in terms of how things are going. He still wants to play that Scout-esque playstyle, and it's not working for Scout either, which obviously, you know, kind of tethers onto a lot of things, but that playstyle where he wants to slowly generate resources early through strong laning and through mid-game pressure, but without really skirmishing a lot, and then take over front to back in 5v5 team fights, playing a lot of control mages. And while that style can be effective in certain instances, it's clearly just not working in the LEC, where skirmish-heavy metas are just taking over, even more so than a lot of the other regions that we talk about here. It's not really acceptable to play slow in the middle of the map. You have to be good at things like Talia and Ryze and Galio in order to really function in the LEC, and Larson is just not the player who really thrives under that playstyle. He's a really bad early skirmisher. He can put himself in bad positions, and most of the time, he just plays way too passive for the rest of his team. That being said, at the very least, bare minimum, he's not down 1,000 gold every single game, which you can't say about the bottom 2 mid laners in terms of my rankings. So he still does come in at number 8, even if I don't really have a ton of confidence in him. I don't think he will perform very well throughout this split. It's just the bottom 2 mid laners are quite bad. We already talked about it with Abadaga. You know, we'll get to it with another player. You can probably guess who a little bit later in the video. But at least for now, Larson, one of those players you probably had to keep from a money perspective, because it's going to be difficult to buy out any of the actual good, you know, tier 2 mid laners coming up, at least in the middle of the year. You're going to have to hope you can get one in the offseason. The third player getting retained here is Malrang, and he's role swapping from jungle to support. This is an interesting proposition because Malrang has always been such an aggressive player, but throughout this year, and really last year especially, he has fallen off quite dramatically in terms of his play. I would argue he's been better so far this year than I was anticipating, but that's only because last year in Brazil, he was a bench-worthy jungler. Like, he was somebody that could not even function in the CB LoL. And so when he came back here and was, you know, below average, like, that's honestly an upgrade over what he was in 2024. Now he's role swapping to support. I have no clue what you're going to get out of Malrang. I don't want to overhype him or underhype him in terms of what he's been so far. He's been your stock standard below average jungler. He's not been terrible. He's not been bottom one, but he's certainly not been average. Like, he's definitely significantly below average, and now he's going to play a position he's never played competitively before. It's a bold decision. We'll see how it ends up working out. You know, he's always been very vocal as a shot caller and as a decision maker. That should translate relatively well, but it's really going to be about whether or not this 2v2 can survive. And that transitions nicely into my conversation around Hans Sam D in the AD carry role. And some people, this is really the one where I'm expecting people to see the number 10 ranking and get kind of upset because he really is very popular as a player. And I do understand why he's so popular. Obviously, the name itself garners a lot of the fan base that he ends up having. You know, Hans Sam D versus Hans Sama will be happening in the LEC at some point this year, which is very exciting, but there are a lot of things to maybe not like as much when it comes to his game. He's been playing for Karmine Corp over in the LFL, and, you know, he's been playing in the ERLs for quite a long time. I remember Sam D from his time from my time covering both the LCK and the LPL many years ago, and this guy was always just like, okay, like, you're fine. Like, you're gonna go down, you know, 50 CS, and you're gonna be able to team fight at a relatively average level. It's gonna be what it is. The one player that I think is the biggest comparison point, and I think there are a couple of reasons for this, is B-Boy over in the LTA right now. I think there's a lot of reasons to compare their careers because I think both of them performed very similarly when they were playing in top-tier Eastern regions, and then they go over to these smaller regions and end up doing a bit better. B-Boy obviously starting to fall off quite a bit over in the LTA, but I think Hans Sam D could be fine at this level. I would expect him to be stable enough, but I don't see any upside for him to turn into like a top 3 or 4 AD carry. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that ages absolutely terribly, but I just don't really see that kind of mechanical prowess coming in from him. It's never been there when we were covering him in the LCK, again in the LPL. It's never really been there for him. He's always just been a below average mechanical player, and that makes me worry that, okay, he's going to be fine, he's going to be stable, but you have Malrang, who's kind of a firecracker, and you have no idea what you're going to get out of him in the support position, and you have an AD carry paired up with him that is much better at playing weak side and definitely wants to be more, you know, not the main character than anything else. It kind of lends me to believe that this team might struggle with some playstyle concerns early on in their tenure. And remember, there's only 4 best of 5s before, you know, 2 teams get eliminated, and so if they're not up to speed quickly, they could very easily just be out before playoffs even start. And part of that is Thager coming into the jungle here. You know, watching Thager's tape, I was really unimpressed. You know, I had him at number 10. I think in most splits, he would be the number 10 jungler in the LEC. Skeens getting signed by SK Gaming definitely changed around that equation at least a little bit. But, you know, I'm really not sold that Thager's going to be able to come in and elevate this team. I think he does a lot of things well. I think he's also incredibly inconsistent as a player. He can be very aggressive, and he's really good at capitalizing, specifically on topside pressure, which is something I really like in terms of how this team is set up. If they are going to play more for Adam, I think that's their pathway to win more games than maybe I'm anticipating. But again, his mechanical ceiling is just really not that high from my perspective. He's not been particularly consistent as a carry, and we'll have to see how he pairs up with someone like Larson in the mid lane. Jungle mid is so relevant in terms of how the game is played right now that if you have a jungle mid that you are concerned about, in this case I am, it's hard for me to believe in the team. You have a role swap support, you've got an AD carry that I think is your high floor, low ceiling type of player, and even if I love Adam on the top side, that's what keeps them out of conversation for 10th. That certainly doesn't put them in the conversation for 7th or 8th in my opinion. Navi still has a lot of places to grow, but as I said at the beginning of this, it's clear that this org is kind of directing itself towards 2026, and if that's the case, then whatever happens this year, I guess, is house money. Then coming in at number 8 for me, it's a team that I think a lot of people are going to have higher, but again, I'm just a little bit lower on them. It's Team Vitality, and there are a lot of reasons why I'm concerned about this team. I don't think all of them are reflected in terms of these player rankings, which I will get into, because if you're just basing my opinion off of these player rankings, this is the best example of not everything is created equally in the entire video, with how much I even disagree with some of these rankings, but we'll go ahead and get into it now. Their lineup is looking like Knock Knocko in the top lane, Linsauce in the jungle, Chayak in the mid lane, Carzzy at AD carry, and Fleshy at support. The one thing that I really want to make clear, and this is, again, the best example of this in the entire video, some positions are just better than others in terms of depth. Carzzy is the best player on this team. He grades out as the best player on this team. Him coming in as the number 8 AD carry is going to make a lot of people mad. I always make people mad with my Carzzy ranking because I am just lower on him, but there are just too many good AD carries in the league. Spoiler alert, like I'm going to say it, and you know, people might disagree with this anyways, but he comes in right below Ice and Flacket for me. I think those two players were just a little bit better over the beginning part of this year. I already had both of them above Carzzy going into the year, and so it just kind of is the way that it is. He's basically on the same ground as the number 5 or number 6 AD carry. It's just a big cluster as per usual. And then there are also positions here like jungle that I said earlier are just so wide open. Basically 6 to 10 are all the same player in terms of skill set. Like Linsauce grades out significantly worse than Carzzy does for me, but jungle is a much easier position to rank up in because of the question marks there. So hope that makes some sense in terms of why I have certain players in certain spots, but we might as well talk about those players first and foremost, talk about the positives with this team. I think, honestly, Carzzy might not even be the biggest positive for me, because right now it's GIANTX in the mid lane that's really impressed me in terms of how he's played the game. He's going to move all the way up to my number 6 mid laner. He is a, you know, perfectly fine mid laner at this level, and I don't know if I was expecting that going into the year. I think he was, you know, I anticipated him to be average to slightly below average. There have been plenty of times where he's been average to slightly above average, which I think is a good place for him to sit as a pseudo rookie here for Vitality. I think he's been playing well, and I think if he continues to grow and kind of become a number 1 option for this team, that's probably best case scenario for Vitality to push up into being number 5 or number 6 in terms of the rankings. I think top 4 are kind of their own little cluster, but number 5 to number 8 I think are all basically in the same spot in terms of like team power rankings. And so if GIANTX can really click and become a number 1 option for this team, I could see them getting as high as number 5 in terms of their rankings, because I already like him as a player, and I think there is a lot of growth still to be had there. And you pair that alongside a player like Carzzy in the bot lane, who obviously has had a ton of success at the LEC level. Now, is Carzzy consistent? No. Has he been below average this year? Yeah, a little bit. Like, he really has not been great, I would say, over the course of 2025. I've always been a bit lower on this player, but he still can be a big positive for a team that he plays for because his mechanical ceiling is so high. He just doesn't really bring it out every single game. There are times where he oversteps and plays, you know, the Jackie Love that everyone hates, where it's like he dies randomly in the middle of a team fight and you just have to live with that because that's Carzzy. And there are some games that he completely pops off. He snowballs the 2v2 early, dominates the game, and ends up looking like the best AD carry in the entire region. Like, that's just, that's part of the experience with Carzzy, and you just kind of have to take the good with the bad. Unfortunately, like I said, there are a lot of good AD carries in the region, and I just don't really see Carzzy as being more valuable than those other players, especially because I don't know what we're going to get out of Fleshy. Even if I am optimistic that he's going to be a pretty good player, or at least an average player in the support position, I'm not sure that this is going to be a top tier bot lane that they're going to be able to consistently win 2v2, and I guess that can transition into talking about Fleshy. You know, I liked him a lot in the ERLs. He's one of the players that is getting promoted here from tier 2 that I actually feel the best about. Again, Team Vitality has had success being able to promote some of their internal players, even someone like Stend for Team Heretics, obviously being a Vitality support last year, you know, has had success at the LEC level. Fleshy has tier 1 experience over in North America on Immortals. People kind of forget that tenure. I think a lot of people would want to forget that tenure, but this is a good player. This is somebody who I do trust to be able to come in and, you know, at least bring some level of floor that Niski absolutely did not bring. You'll see the -2 here in parentheses. This is where I really want to specify that this is in relation to what I thought Niski was going to be as a support. Niski was not the 6th best support in the LEC. He was nowhere close. This should be an upgrade in the support position by a considerable amount, but it's about how dominant he can be early on in the 2v2, because I think that's so important towards Carzzy's game and towards his ability to be able to snowball things out of control. If he's not able to generate leads, he's really not the kind of player that plays all that well from neutral, and so it's really going to be about whether they click in the 2v2. Again, I'm hopeful this will definitely be better than what it was in spring, but is that enough to elevate the team? Again, you're talking about a team that needs to be able to compete with, you know, a lot of the other playoff teams that have clear-cut number 1 options. If Carzzy's going to have to be that for Vitality, Fleshy has to be able to step up in that regard as well. And then you get to the top side of the map. I feel okay about the top side of the map, which is kind of surprising. People might see the Linsauce ranking and be very shocked because I've been very low on this player so far in the LEC, but I would argue that his best tape in the LEC has come over the past split or so. I think he showed more in spring than he ever did before that. Not to say that he's a great player by any stretch of the imagination. Ironically enough, I think he comes in with the exact same grade now that he did at the beginning of the year. It's just the jungle position at the bottom is so open, like so beatable in terms of how things are going. Nobody's really established themselves. That the fact that Linsas was probably the best of those junglers in terms of LEC tapes specifically in spring means he jumps all the way up to number 6. Again, I cannot stress enough just how volatile that position is, but you know, there's something in there to unlock. I loved him as a player before he ended up coming up to the LEC. He was getting offers from North America to go over there as well as a prospect and ended up being the starter here for Vitality. There is something to grow into, and he's been given some time to develop. I don't know if he has like top tier upside. Maybe this is just the best version of Linsas, but if that's the case, there are enough matchups that he can take advantage of that I think he can still be average on this team, even if he's not nearly as good as some of the other players. And then Nako is a tough conversation to have, man, because he looked so promising in winter. Really felt like this was going to be a player with ridiculous mechanical upside, the definition of a feast or famine top laner, where when he won, he looked incredible. When he lost, he looked terrible. His mechanics were insane. His mental was quite bad, right? Like that mold of a player. We see a lot of top laners like this come through the system, but it took a really big step back in spring. He was significantly worse in spring than he was in winter. And if that's going to be the case, you know, he's going to start falling in terms of prospect rankings. There were other standout rookie top laners across last split that I think started to take some of the buzz away from Nako. I still believe he's the most mechanically talented of all of those rookie top laners, but he needs to start being able to unlock it more consistently. Again, he is a lane-focused 1v1 dominant type of player. If he can start getting into these matchups more consistently and actually generating big leads for himself on the top side, whether or not he does anything with them in the back half of the game, at least that will be something to build on. Again, in spring, we didn't see nearly as much of it as we did in winter, which does concern me a bit, but it's just a lot of question marks here for Vitality. If everything clicks, if Linsas, you know, is even just the player he was in spring, or even if he continues to grow, which I think is possible, Nako could get back to what he was as an aggressive, you know, mechanically oriented top laner. Chaya could continue to grow. Fleshy could be an upgrade. Karzi could start being a bit, you know, more consistent, or at least roll a little bit better on some of these games. Like Vitality can be top 5. There's absolutely nothing stopping them from doing that. I just think there's more question marks when it comes to Vitality than there is when it comes to some of the other teams, at least across all positions, even if they don't really have a true weakness in their game right now. Then moving on to number 7 in my power rankings, and this is a team I did not expect to feel good about going in to the end of this year, but they've made a lot of progress. It's Team Heretics coming in at number 7 for me. I like this roster. I think they've made a lot of, you know, big growth movements over the course of this year. They've grown a lot, I guess is probably a better way to put that, as a team. A lot of the young players that they brought in that I did not expect a lot out of in year 1 have gotten better, and I think it's really cool to see that this team is now in a spot where they actually can just compete for, you know, top 6 and top 5 and kind of be in that conversation. I think a lot of it comes down to their veterans playing really well, but again, really big step up moments from a couple of players that maybe I didn't expect it out of. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Carlson in the top lane, Sheo in the jungle, Kamalu in the mid lane, Flacket at AD carry, and Stend at support. The good with this team is absolutely still the veterans, even if there has been a lot of development coming in from other players. Sheo and Flacket are absolutely the main characters here, and I would say both of them are in pretty similar spots. Again, Flacket comes in a couple of spots below Sheo, if only just because AD carry is much better than jungle is right now, but Sheo kind of breaks that threshold. I think he's the worst of the good junglers in the LEC, if that makes sense. Like, I think top 4 are all very good in terms of just how they play the map. You can guess who the top 4 junglers are, and then Sheo is kind of flirting with that range. Like, he's your classic B caliber player, where he's not quite a B+, he's not quite an A-, not quite the player that's going to be actively, you know, big in terms of trying to make the world championships, but certainly is somebody that can be a good piece, and even could be the 4th or 5th piece on a team that makes worlds. You know, Sheo has been that in the past, but he's been given much more responsibility here on Heretics, and I think he's lived up to it. He's been very good for this team. I think you could argue he's been the best performing member of this team throughout this year. I would make that argument in terms of just how important he's been, and I've just been excited to see him in a more open role, we'll just say. For BDS, I was pretty critical of him as a player because it always felt like he was just benefiting a lot from having really talented lanes, where he was playing with Adam, who was constantly winning on the top side, Ice, who was constantly in a position to team fight in the later part of the game. You even had someone like Nuke, who made a ton of strides and developments as like a mid laner who could play 1v1 early on in games. Sheo was kind of the beneficiary, playing Sejuani and playing Maokai in a lot of those games, and he comes over here to Heretics and shows a whole new dimension of his game that I think I'm really glad to know has been there all along. I really like Sheo. I think a lot of good teams would like to have a jungler like this, and Flacket's in a very similar position. This guy is consistently underrated at the LEC level. I genuinely don't know what else people need to see out of Flacket before they just believe that he's a very good player for the LEC level. I get that the G2 time frame, like that whole experience kind of clouded people's minds and ideas as to what Flacket could be, but he is not that guy anymore. He hasn't been that guy in at least a year and a half in terms of how he played. He came in last year for Heretics when that team was desperately looking for anything to stabilize, and he was the best player on the team down the stretch, maybe outside of GIANTX, who continued to be positive. But then he comes back this year with a bunch of rookies surrounding him, and you know what? He's still super good for this team. He's still pushing a lot of advantages, and honestly, I just don't really know what else you can want to see from him. He's good at playing strong side. He's good at playing weak side. He's not a superstar. He's not somebody who's going to elevate a team to being a world's contender, but is he, better than Carzzy? Yeah, probably. Like, at least from my perspective, he has been for a majority of this year. So hopefully Flacket can keep that up, because I think there is just a lot to like. And you know what? It's been super consistent ever since he came back to Team Heretics again. So, I like Flacket. I know it's not the most popular opinion, but him and Sheo as the veterans on this team have clearly helped this team a lot. They were top 6 in the spring split, and I don't think a lot of people were anticipating that. Part of that is Stend, who I think was the one support I was ready to accept was going to be good in year 1. I really liked his tape coming out of Vitality B. I thought he was going to be a pretty solid player, maybe not quite as much as I liked Paris's tape, but obviously Paris has struggled more. Stend has been a better support at this level, and he continues to be a big playmaker for this team. He's actually been a big reason why this team has been so consistent in terms of the way they want to play. A lot of teams that rely on a couple of players can sometimes be taken off of their A game because they don't, they have more exploitable weaknesses, which we will talk about later for Heretics. But Stend, I think, stabilizes the team in a lot of big ways because his macro and his shot calling is very good, or at least his ability to play around fights and find flank angles is very, very good. He's a good team fight support. He's pretty decent in lane as well to be able to generate leads for Flacket in particular, but I like him as a playmaker. I like him as somebody who's going to be out on the map looking to be aggressive, and I think he's good enough to be a mid-table support, which is what he was last split. And then Carlson, talk about the breakthrough player of spring. This guy absolutely leapfrogged his way up these top lane rankings. We talked about a player in Nako who kind of got passed up by other rookie supports. Well, Carlson was the rookie support that kind of passed him up in terms of the tape we saw. He was excellent down the stretch. Now, he was pretty terrible in winter. He was not somebody I expected to be great at the beginning of the year, and so I do want to take this with a little bit of a grain of salt, because I think there's a world where he ends up just being a little bit worse than maybe we're anticipating on the top side, where he kind of comes back down to earth. That's happened to other prospects in the past in terms of like small sample size breakouts, but over the last back half of the regular season and then into the playoff run for Team Heretics, he was arguably the best player on this team in terms of how things were performing, consistently winning 1v1 on the top side and making huge impacts in team fights. Like he had a really good eye for what exactly he needed to do in 5v5. So I'm hopeful that that development is real, and for now I'm going to trust that it is. I'm going to move him up to number 7 and kind of put him in a spot where, okay, if you have another good split, you're going to be flirting around top 5 in terms of where you are with top laners. The one player, though, that really holds this team back, at least right now, is still Camelou in the mid lane. We kind of knew this was going to be the case. He was promoted from Tier 3 up to Tier 1, really without ever having a chance to play in Tier 2. That's always a very risky proposition. Sometimes it really works. Danny is a great example of that over in North America. Even Jackie's, I was trying to think of his name. Jackie's is a great example of that here in Europe as well, although Jackie's is kind of returning back to earth right now. But Camelou has really struggled to make that transition. He's a pretty stock standard mid laner in the sense that when he's neutral or when he wins, especially in the mid lane, when he's able to get a gold lead, because he's not the worst laner in the world, when he's going up against somebody in a good matchup where he can just kind of push his advantage, he can be a decently valuable player that can actually add to Team Heretics' success. When he loses harder than any other mid laner in the league, and it's not particularly close. He is just so unbelievably inconsistent, and his bad games are terrible. Honestly, the player he reminds me the most of is Seiken. I think he plays so similarly to Seiken. He's not quite as scared as Seiken was for K Corp last year, but I think it's similar in the sense that you just need to get him into a spot around 15 minutes where he can feel that he's neutral, where he can feel that he's comfortable to play forward, because when he's behind in gold, he's going to let the team feel it. It's almost unwinnable for Team Heretics when Camelou ends up getting camped or loses hard in the mid lane. That is something that he needs to be able to weed out of the system. I think there are still a ton of mental errors coming in from him as a player. He doesn't really shove and roam at a high level either. He's a very limited player in terms of how he plays, but there is enough talent on this team to be able to make up for it, which is why it ends up elevating Team Heretics above a team like Vitality, who has a much better mid laner in Chayak. I think Carlson should be able to win more consistently than Nako on the top side. Flacket and Stend, quite frankly, should be the better bot lane between them and like a Carzzy and a Fleshy, and then like Sheo is just a better jungler than Linsauce. Heretics have a really good surrounding core. I'm not all that surprised that they ended up making top 6. There's another team that I think made some fantastic changes in the offseason that makes me more excited about them, which is what knocks Heretics outside of that top 6. But if they're a top 5 team and they continue to grow, especially if Camelou can figure something out and start to get better in the same way Jackie's did in summer of last year, I don't know, man. Again, Heretics can still be a gigantic threat because of the talent on this team. Then moving on to number 6 in my power rankings. Top 6 is no longer playoffs because top 8 technically ends up making playoffs, but this is still kind of a milestone, and coming in at number 6 for me, it is GIANTX, a team that I have believed in for the most part throughout all of this year, but really it's because they're so specialized in terms of what they're good at, and the things they're bad at, they're actually pretty bad at. This is a team I could absolutely see crashing out and getting 8th, but I could also see them continuing to get top 5 like they have been all year long up until this point. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Lot in the top lane, Isma in the jungle, Jackie's in the mid lane, Noah at AD carry, and Jun at support. Of course, good and bad with the GIANTX roster as we've known throughout the year. This is probably one of the more polarizingly, constructed rosters just in terms of how things end up breaking down, because I think the lane that's really good here is genuinely really good, like world's caliber good in terms of what their bot lane is. And Jackie's has the upside to be an incredibly good mid laner at this level, even if he really has not shown that at all in 2025. It's the top side that really concerns me, so we'll break that down as we continue to talk about it more. But Noah and Jun, I have no concerns over. I'm still buying in entirely to how good this bot lane is, and they showed that throughout all of this year up until this point. They go over to GIANTX. I think some of that expectation, some of that pressure that was on players like Noah and Jun on Fnatic, it's definitely alleviated going to an org like GIANTX that doesn't have nearly the same kind of publicity, nearly the same kind of expectation, and they're kind of just allowed to play League and not really worry about everything outside the bubble, and they're absolutely good enough to be a bot lane that can elevate a team to being really good. They are a world's caliber bot lane, and that has become very clear on GIANTX. Their 2v2 stats are incredible, but it's Noah's team fighting that really elevates things. Jun's mid games are some of the best in the entire league in terms of how things break down. I really believe in these two players, and I think I'm not just going to throw out the fact that they were really good for a majority of the year because GIANTX didn't do particularly well in the playoffs. They still ended up in 5th place, which is not particularly bad, but Noah and Jun, I think, are the reason this team is relevant under any circumstance. And if this team is going to elevate themselves to somehow be better than what they had been over the beginning part of this year, it's because either these two continue to take a step up and genuinely become like a top 2 bot lane in the league, which, while I don't think is likely, I think is theoretically possible, or alternatively, they just continue to be solid and the rest of this team finally figures out what the hell they want to be, because it's not on Noah and Jun. Jun is, I think on a better team, we'd be calling him the best support in the league. Obviously, with him being on this team, there are a lot of things that just naturally don't work out nearly as much, but he has the playstyle and the talent to be that. And Noah, as I've said, a very consistent player, much better in team fights than he is early on in the 2v2, but still can absolutely win early in the 2v2, especially if they're playing strong side towards bot lane. So feel good about them. And then there's Jackie's in the mid lane. We just need him to be even like 75% of what he was in summer of 2024. A lot of people were talking about Jackie's last year, and trust me, I was kind of there, but I want to remind people, I did not name him my Rookie of the Year, and in fact, I heavily criticized him winning Rookie of the Year. I thought it was absolutely ridiculous, not because he wasn't the best rookie in summer of 2024. He absolutely was better than players like Supa and Alvaro that ended up not winning the award over him, but it's Rookie of the Year. It's not Rookie of the Split for summer, and pretending like Jackie's wasn't a bottom 2 mid laner in the spring split of last year and also was inconsistent in winter would have been ridiculous. And going into this year, I did talk about how, yeah, he's got tremendous upside, but there is a pretty low floor for a player that really has only been good for 1 split in his entire career, and unfortunately, that's kind of been the case. We've really gotten like 2024 winter Jackie's throughout the entire rest of this year. There have been good games, there have been moments where he's looked positive, but for the most part, he's kind of just been a slightly below average mid laner at this level, and he's definitely taken a step back from what that summer performance was. I don't like being right when I'm more negative about a player, but it just kind of was the case. Jackie's is certainly not the player everyone thought he was going to be after such a limited sample size, and now we're looking at a position where he has to get back to that in order for this team to make the kind of run that they want to make over the back half of this year. We know that GIANTX's bot lane is good enough. They need a secondary lane to play through. That has to be Jackie's, because I just don't believe it's going to be the top side of the map. Isma comes over from SK Gaming and, or I guess technically from K Corp Blue, but Isma comes over and is, he's Isma, right? Like his bad games are the worst in the league. Like when he looks terrible, he looks like he's unplayable at this level. There were a couple of games where he looked very good for GIANTX in the same way that there were a couple of games where he looked very good for SK at the beginning of the year, because when he gets to play from a lead, and especially when he's aggressive in the the early game when he gets to play for, you know, level 3, level 4, level 5 skirmishes, he's actually really good at those. That's his specialty as a player, is fighting early, especially around these objectives. The problem is when he doesn't get to do that, he's pretty bad as a player. Honestly, he's Malrang in terms of what his jungle pathing is, and that's just not quite as successful in the modern game. And I think it's really kind of taken it out on GX's consistency, because again, when he goes into the mid game and he's just down resources because he's not a particularly good tempo player in terms of being able to keep up and farm and also make sure his lanes are in a good position. He's just not very good at that style of the game. When he goes into the mid game down resources, then it's basically unplayable for him, and he ends up looking like he's the worst jungler in the entire universe. And so he's just a very specific player in terms of what his skill set lends and what kind of playstyle he needs to play in order to get the most out of that. And unfortunately, that's not good with the rest of this team. Noah wants to play for team fights. Jackie's wants to play for his own individual leads. Isma taking a lot of the attention away in the jungle is not necessarily a good fit. Again, we've seen games where it's worked, especially towards the end of the spring split, but we need to see a lot more, and we need to see that consistency start to grow. I need to see him not become so one-dimensional as a player. And Lot in the top lane, talk about a guy who started off the year pretty good. Actually looked pretty solid in winter, and quite frankly, he's just gotten worse every single game that he's played over the course of this year. His lane stats are not good. His laning eye test is horrible. Like, he completely fails the 1v1 eye test in terms of just how things are going there. His mechanical ceiling, it's not like what Carlson and Knock were as rookie top laners coming into the league in terms of how we talk about him. He is your standard weak side top laner. His mechanics are average to slightly below average. He's a good team fighter, but he needs to be able to get there. And again, it goes alongside the rest of this team where he's way too specialized as a player, and in a league where top laners generally are very talented and can kind of crush you in the 1v1 and counter pick matchups, Lot is oftentimes on weak side and losing, which is just not a good recipe for GIANTX. There is potential in there because he was doing a lot better at this in the winter split, but remember, lane swaps were a lot more common at the beginning of this year. It was a lot easier to be able to get your top laner out of these terrible matchups than it is right now, and I think Lot has struggled a lot more now that he actually has to face the music and try to go up against these more mechanically talented tier 1 caliber top laners. And so for GIANTX, while I do think they have a lot building for them, a lot going for them in terms of the talent on this roster, Noah and Jun are tremendous and absolutely should not just be fighting to get top 6, but should be fighting to get top 4 or even higher than that. The rest of this roster just has too many question marks for me to put them any higher than this. Jackie's has to get back into form from last year. If he doesn't, if he is just what he is this year, that's a below average mid laner, even if it is only just slightly. Isma's crazy one-dimensional. Lot is also one-dimensional, and both of them end up, you know, kind of doing the opposite of what each other is good at. Isma wants to play fast and aggressive, and Lot can't really do that to save his life. And so for GIANTX, it's just about finding some sort of identity that ends up working for all the players involved. Right now, they feel like a team with a lot of talent that just don't have any cohesion, and if that's the case, they're going to be nowhere near trying to fight for top 4, but this team has still ended up in 5th regardless of all that because of just how dominant the bot lane has been. So maybe that ends up happening again, but with another team, again, making a lot of good roster changes in the offseason. I think they are likely a candidate for some major regression in summer. Then moving on to number 5 in my power rankings, and this is really the bold take I have going into this split. I think this team got significantly better this offseason, and I think they will show it on the Rift. It's Team BDS coming all the way in at number 5 in my power rankings after finishing in 8th in the spring split. I'm sure this is not the most popular opinion in the entire world, but I firmly do believe that they are a team that should be around here, and if they're not, I think it's an underperformance. I think 8th was completely unacceptable in terms of the roster they had put together, but their biggest weaknesses, I think, have been addressed. The inconsistency out of the jungle position and the poor play in top lane, the lack of upside in terms of what Irrelevant ended up bringing to BDS. I think those major factors have been, you know, kind of touched upon. Now, not everything is perfect here. You are still taking some risks in terms of the players you're bringing on, but I think these risks are significantly better founded now than they were at the beginning of the year. So let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like Rooster in the top lane, Bukata in the jungle, Nuke in the mid lane, Ice at AD carry, and Paris at support. 2 new players on the top side of the map. We will get to them a little bit later. Let's start with the core of this team, the 2 players that have been around for the successes and the failures of BDS so far in the past couple of years. Nuke in the mid lane and Ice in the AD carry role. We'll start with Nuke because he really is the franchise player for BDS at this point. I'm the biggest Nuke defender on the planet. This guy has been nothing but a top mid laner for the past 2 years in the LEC, and honestly, like, if you wanted to put him top 3, I'm really not going to be all that upset with you. I think top 3 is hard to convince me of right now with how well JoJo played down the stretch of the split and really kind of the form he got himself into, but Nuke is crazy consistent. He's really learned to do all of the little things at an incredibly high level, and I really just don't have concerns with him. I think, again, very similar to the conversation we had about GIANTX's bot lane, this is one of those lanes that I think you can play around and be a Worlds team. Like, Nuke can be your number 1 or number 2 option, and you can be a top 4 team in the LEC. I firmly believe that he has that kind of talent. Now, the upside is still, I guess there's a question there, like can he ever be top 2? Probably not. Like, he's never going to be a Caps, he's never going to be a JoJo Pune, he's never going to be a Vladi, in terms of the way that he plays the game. He's just not that kind of player, and there is a world where he doesn't even have the same kind of upside as someone like Poby coming in for Fnatic, but at the end of the day, Nuke is so stable, so consistent, that I would be remiss to put him anywhere outside of the top 4, because that's all he's been over the past 2 years. He's gotten better every year that he's played in the LEC, and I imagine that that will continue, and I really believe that he is the core of BDS, and so being able to retain him, even when this team was bad, he was performing well. I feel good about Nuke. And the bot lane, while they haven't shown everything throughout this split, I still think there's some upside here to really figure something out and become a genuinely good bot lane. Ice is unfortunately a very limited player in terms of how he plays the game. We liked Ice going into the year quite a bit, because he was so good in his role in 2024 that it really made me feel good that he could continue that in 2025. Lo and behold, team roster construction changes a little bit, things kind of swap around overall, and Ice goes from being the best team fighter in the entire league to, still one of the best team fighters in the entire league, but having a lot more trouble getting there. Players like Labrav really helped that identity. Players like Sheo really helped that identity to be able to establish that for Ice, and getting those players out of here and replacing them with players that were much more aggressive. 113 and Paris, who were much more skirmish-oriented, I don't think played towards the playstyle that Ice was looking for. Now, if Paris can start to develop a little bit more at playing like the slow, more Labrav-esque kind of game, I think that could really help Ice. We saw some developments in that area from Paris throughout the back end of the split, but the inconsistency from him has really made me question what this bot lane can actually become, because as much as I really do like Ice as a player, and I do think that he has the talent to carry games when he's on Zeri or Aphelios or Jinx or a lot of these late game carries, he's not a good laner, and he's not a good skirmisher, and so you do need to get him into the later part of the game for him to feel like a top 80 carry. There are win conditions for him where he just insta-wins the game. Again, when you get him on these hyper carries in the back half, his spacing, his positioning, and his comfort level in that role is incredibly high, but we need to see growth from the rest of the team to help get him there for me to feel comfortable, because I don't think Ice is going to make those developments in the early 2v2. I just don't think he's ever going to be all that good in that phase of the game, but Paris is really who you're looking at as the player that needs to start developing, who needs to come along. I was so high on Paris coming into the year. I thought his tape last year and even the year before in the LFL was absolutely phenomenal. This guy looked like he was going to be a game-breaking type of support at the LEC level, and that has just not been the case so far this year. He's not even been the best rookie support in the LEC. That absolutely goes to Stend, and so you're looking at a situation where Paris needs to start figuring out how to play with the rest of this team. He wanted to be more of a playmaker, more of a skirmisher, and again, with 113, that made a lot of sense in the jungle, but with Ice as an AD carry, it kind of took away a lot of his great qualities. I think Paris is starting to learn to play a bit slower, starting to learn to play a bit more from a tempo perspective and from a macro perspective, which I think he can do, but again, I just don't know if it's a great fit between these two as a bot lane. Hopefully Paris can start coming along, because again, the upside is there, but the inconsistency is absolutely there as well. His bad games still look pretty horrible, and I wouldn't say there's been a ton of growth from the beginning of winter to the end of spring. I think he has basically just been an inconsistent to slightly below average support at this level, and he needs to be better than that, but that really is what brings us to the top side of the map here, the two new players coming on to BDS. First off, Bukata, who's coming over from SK Gaming, staying in the LEC, but that's 3 teams in 1 year for Bukata, as he starts off outside of the LEC, ends up getting picked up by SK, and now moving over here to BDS. This is theoretically an upgrade on paper in terms of consistency. For sure, Bukata is somebody that absolutely should be more stable than 113. I will continue to defend 113 as a player, because I think his good games were still very good. It's not like you were taking away a lot of that mechanical ceiling that he had as a player. It's more so the bad games that you just had to live with and be like, you got to start like figuring it out, man. And I understand this team in the position that they're in, not wanting to worry about that consistency, wanting to go for someone who still has quite a bit of upside and has had success at lower levels in Bukata, but maybe not someone who's floundered as much in terms of the bad games at the top end level, even going back to the Astralis days. So I get the move. I'm more so, confused as to why SK let him go in the first place. It is quite confusing that they would make a deal for him in the middle of the year and then immediately let him walk, but this should be a stabilizing presence. I still think he's at his best when he's able to play the map in the mid game. That's what I talked about with him going into SK Gaming. It wasn't necessarily the case before, but hopefully it ends up being the case here on BDS because they should have more tempo coming out of mid lane and out of top lane. But if Bukata is able to take that next leap, he can be a top 5 jungler, top 6 jungler as of right now. He has that kind of upside. Again, he only comes in pretty low because we didn't get to see it on SK with the bad lanes that they ended up having. And then Rooster on the top side is really kind of the turning point, I would say, for this team. Irrelevant was a complete disaster for them, one of the worst signings of the offseason, and nobody could have really predicted that coming into it. I think top lane got weaker going into 2025 as compared to 2024. Quite a lot of players that would have been near the top of the rankings for me were no longer in the league, and so you end up with a player like, Irrelevant feeling like he should be able to break out on a better team with better surrounding core, and he just plays the worst split, the worst year, quite frankly, he's ever had in his entire career. Ends up getting replaced here, and Rooster is a very, very good replacement. For those of you who don't watch the LCK Challengers League like I do, you might not know who Rooster is because he's been stuck in Hanwha Life jail for quite a long time, but this is just one of those classic cases of a really good prospect that is consistently stuck behind other players at the LCK level because he plays for one of the best organizations in the entire region in Hanwha Life. There was no way he was ever going to come in and replace Doran or Zeus or any player like that, and so he never really found an opportunity to be able to make his way into the top lane, but he's right there from a talent perspective in that big class of top laners that's come through the Challengers League recently with players like Shiwu and Thanatos and Perfect and, Harangi. Like, a lot of those players that ended up being, either successful in the LCK or just kind of losing their, spot with Harangi for Gen G, obviously. Rooster was, right there. He's been a top-performing top laner for many years now. He's been the best top laner in the LCK Challengers League this year so far, and so I like this pickup a lot. I think there's a chance he could be a top 2 top laner basically from day number 1. I'm not ruling out that kind of possibility, but really when you talk about Rooster, his biggest pro is his consistency. He's not going to have the crazy pop-off moments. I don't really see him as this big game-breaking threat, although I think he has the mechanics to potentially turn his game into that. What he's really good at is being super stable on the top side, consistently being up in gold, and then making big impacts in team fights. I said the word already, but the comp for a player like Rooster at the top end level is what Impact has been over the course of his career, where you can reliably put him in basically any situation, either on a carry or on a tank. He's going to be fine in lane, and he's going to be a really big deal. Obviously, Impact in 2025, maybe not the best comparison for that, but that's the kind of playstyle you can imagine for a player like Rooster, and coming in, if he does that from day 1, that's a huge boon for BDS. I think this might be the biggest positional swing of any pickup in the entire league across this split because of just how bad BDS's topside was last year and just how good, or last split, and just how good it can be this split if everything were to click. I think Bukata has the potential to take that leap, but even if he doesn't, Rooster and Nuke should be 2 of the more mechanically talented players in their solo lanes. Ice and Paris, while they shouldn't dominate the 2v2, hopefully are getting more comfortable playing together and getting to that late game. If you can just be that bridge coming out of the jungle, BDS absolutely should be a top 5 team. And, even if they're not going to be expected to perform like this, anything less than 5th or 6th, in my opinion, for BDS should be considered a disappointment. But that brings us to number 4 in my power rankings, and you guys can probably predict that top 4 is kind of in a league of their own. They're the 4 best teams in the LEC until proven otherwise, and I do not think the order that I put them in is going to be consensus by any stretch of the imagination, so I'm excited to go through that. But coming in at number 4 for me, this one much more consensus, it will be Fnatic. I just can't put them higher than number 4 right now. I think that there are way too many things up in the air when it comes to this team. Hopefully they get a bit more consistent with the change that they made in the mid lane, but there's just no guarantees with anything that Fnatic has been doing over the past couple of years. They've gone from the kings and the pinnacle of European League of Legends to a team that just can't seem to get out of their own way when they try to get over the hump. So let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is, of course, looking like Oscarinen in the top lane, Razork in the jungle, Poby in the mid lane, Upset at AD carry, and Mickey X at support. New mid lane, very much the same Fnatic through and through in terms of the way that they're going to play the game. A lot of the core pieces that determine the Fnatic playstyle are very much still here in terms of how things are constructed, and that is a good thing because I think the floor of this team is still pretty high, and they're going to perform well in the regular season. They basically always do, but the question is, can they get out of their own way when it comes to these big best of fives in the playoffs that they've just not been able to figure things out in, because that's been the real problem. Let's go ahead and talk about it. Let's start with the good lane, the bot lane here, which I firmly believe against the grain right now, is the best bot lane in the LEC. And I know that that's a crazy thing to say, because quite frankly, they were not the best bot lane in the playoffs when it mattered the most. They really weren't even close to what KOI was putting out in terms of Supa and Alvaro, who were fantastic. I think that there are people who would put K-Corp's bot lane above Fnatic's as well. I think that there are some genuine conversations to have when it comes to that, but for me, Upset and Mickey still are the highest floor bot lane in the entire league. I just kind of know what I'm going to get out of these two. I will say Upset does fall to my number 2 AD carry rather than just being my number 1 ADC, because I think in big moments he can sometimes be a little bit too passive. You know, there is a player comparison here for Upset. I think their career paths are very different, but I don't think Upset is all that dissimilar to what Sven was for so many years in the LEC, for Origin, for G2. I don't think it's all that crazy to say that his arc right now is very similar to Sven. Obviously, you know, Upset had some bad years in the middle there where he was on some bad teams that Sven never really had to deal with in terms of how things are going, and it's been very different ever since Sven went over to North America, but I think it's kind of a fair comparison of, like, he's obviously one of the most talented AD carries in the entire league, but sometimes he does lack that killer instinct to be the number 1 option on a team that does want to push to be number 1 in the league. He has the talent to do so. Does he have the mentality to do so? Always will be a bit of a question mark. It comes out more so in the playoffs, is why it's so frustrating, because in those big moments, you want him to be able to step up and you want him to be super aggressive and to play like he knows he's one of the best ADCs, and that's the time where he doesn't do that, which is inherently more frustrating. But Upset is still fantastic. During the regular season, I would argue that he probably was, I don't know, I would say him and Kaliste were kind of trading back best AD carry, you know, back and forth, whichever way you wanted to go with that. I think part of it ends up being Mickey X being so good to help out Upset, but Upset is fantastic, and Mickey X is still the best support in Europe. I think that that is clear. It's an odd year, and so Mickey X is going to be listed as the number 1 support. It's just kind of how things go. Every odd year he plays fantastic. It just is the Mickey X trend, but he's been everything Fnatic could have wanted from him and then some throughout this year so far. Hopefully he's able to keep up that form, because he is really the only thing keeping Fnatic afloat in top 2 conversations in terms of how things are breaking down. The rest of this roster has a ton of inconsistency, even if they have been stepping up at parts of this year, and I think it really is Mickey X that is, like, the one that makes me feel good about Fnatic, because Upset, I just don't know in big moments. I trust Mickey in big moments. I trust him to be able to make the right plays at the right times, and he's very hot right now. He's not making the mistakes he made for a lot of last year, which is obviously really, really big. So, still the best support in Europe, despite the fact that I think a lot of other supports are really starting to come into their own right now. And then you have the top side of the map, Oscar Renin and Razork, both playing some of the best League of their career in completely different ways. Like, Razork is playing the worst League of his career in the playoffs, which is obviously really, really bad timing, and I think at this point we just kind of understand who Razork is as a player. He's gonna be awesome when he generates a lead in the early game. He's like the stereotypical example of when he has a gold lead going into 15 to 20 minutes, when he gets to play super aggressive and when his laners are all winning early on in a game, he's gonna look like $1 million. He's gonna look like the MVP of the entire league, and when that doesn't happen, he's genuinely bad, like, as a player. He really just is very conditional in terms of him being elite. I've been saying this for years on the channel. I've been receiving pushback every single year, not only from, you know, comments here, but from other analysts in the scene where it's like, you know, how can you not consider Razork an MVP caliber talent? And in 2024, I started to be like, well, I guess I was wrong. You started to figure things out. But once again, the playoff woes are just too important. When the games slow down, when teams get a little bit more clinical in terms of their macro and their execution, and it stops being such a fiesta, Razork gets worse as a player. And that just is the way that it goes. He relies on a very specific game state, and he can't always create that game state for himself. Now, in the regular season, I have a feeling he's going to be just fine, because those games are still going to be aggressive. You're still going to see that, you know, pedal to the metal type of mentality, and he really thrives in those chaotic back and forth games. But it's all really about, can he be that guy in those big moments? For now, I'm worried the answer to that is no, so he comes in at number 3 in terms of those jungle rankings. And then for Oscar Renin, you could argue, and I would argue, he's playing the best League of his entire career right now, and I firmly believe that. Still, there are some problems in the playoffs, and again, like, it all just comes back to bite Fnatic, where Oscar starts to get targeted a bit more in these best of 5s, and in Fearless, he starts to get his champion pool taken away a little bit more, and all of a sudden, he looks a lot worse in games 3 and 4 than he did in games 1 and 2, and that, I think, is always just going to be a concern when it comes to Oscar Renin. I don't think he has the biggest champion pool. I certainly don't think he has the consistency to survive weak side on champions he's bad at, and so it leads you into the situation where you kind of have to play around topside if you're Fnatic, and that's not ideal for them. That's what keeps him out of the top 3, even though throughout a majority of the year, he's without a doubt been a top 3 top laner. he's been better than Adam in terms of production, but my thought process and my question is, if I'm building a team right now and I want to win the LEC, I want to try and push to be top 1, and I can sign either Adam or Oscarinen, I'm signing Adam. I just am. I think he has more going for him to keep him in that top 3. If Oscar ends up continuing to take another leap, I think that that's fair, but there is a reason Fnatic was looking at replacing Oscarinen this offseason alongside Humanoid, and it's because I do think there is an inherent cap, an inherent ceiling to what Oscar offers as a player because of his champion pool limitations. So just kind of is what it is. He comes in as number 4 for me on the top side. And then the big name, the big story and news and offseason signing surrounding the LEC, Poby coming over from T1 Challengers to play for Fnatic as the starting mid laner. Humanoid is out. He's been here for years, I believe 3-4 years now, something like that, as the starting mid laner. This is a big change. This completely changes the identity of the team because not only is Poby a different player, but he's much less established than Humanoid is as a player as well. Humanoid kind of receiving a brunt of the criticism for not performing in the playoffs, although I think it's the entire team that really deserves to be criticized for that. But I've been a proponent that you have to break up this mid-jungle duo at some point for Fnatic. It's clear that they are just not all that synergistic, and they've kept them around for so many years. They've never played off of each other well. Humanoid wants resources, crazy style. Like, he wants to be able to snowball, and so does Razork, but they both need attention in order to do so, and you can't often get both of them going at the same time, which means that you do need to make a change, and Poby, while he might not have been the player I would have gone for, is certainly a different kind of player. This is somebody who's received a lot of attention because he's the mid laner in T1 system that's behind Faker. He filled in for Faker in the LCK for an extended period of time a couple of years ago when Faker was having some injury issues, and he was terrible in the LCK. Genuinely one of the worst mids in the entire league. That team went on a gigantic losing streak without Faker, and of course he came back in and fixed the team, but he goes back down to the Challengers League and is still like an average to slightly above average mid laner, like certainly not something that stands out at the tier 2 level. And then spring happens and he has his best split ever, and that's encouraging. He did make a leap, I would say, over the beginning part of 2025. There are a lot of people out there that will tell you that Poby is not a good prospect, and I would agree he's not a great prospect in terms of this top tier 2 player coming over from the Challengers League, but I think that there were more encouraging traits at the start of this year than there have ever been for Poby, specifically when it comes to his in-lane performance. If he can just be stable in the mid lane, you have enough wild cards on this team. Razork is a wild card that you would rather, be the one taking a lot of the resources. Upset is kind of a wild card that you would rather take a lot of the resources. If Poby can come in and just not be Humanoid, where he can just be stable, you can kind of expect the same thing game in and game out from him, and you don't have to worry about him too much, that's already an upgrade for Fnatic, because even if he's less mechanically talented than someone like Humanoid is, which I think there's an argument for. Humanoid, he would throw away games for Fnatic just by being overly aggressive and not allowing his teammates to carry him. If Poby can just settle in, maybe you can get resources into some better spots, and maybe everybody starts looking better. That being said, that's still a major question mark. I don't even have him rated as a top 4 mid laner coming into the league, and I think that there is some questions about whether or not he actually can get there this year. So as much as I do like this team, there are too many worries. Razork and Oscar are way too inconsistent. Upset still doesn't have that killer instinct, and Mickey, while I love him, can't do everything on his own. So for Fnatic, while I do believe they are in the upper echelon of teams, and it is a top 4 and not like a top 2 and then a next 2, I believe they're at the bottom of that upper grouping, and I would be the most surprised if they were the team that ended up coming out on top. Then moving on to number 3 in my power rankings, and this is where I think I'm going to start sparking some controversy, especially in terms of the player rankings, because coming in at number 3 for me, it will be G2 Esports, a team that just represented the region at both MSI and the EWC, and, did look better as of their recent showing at the EWC, but I have real concerns that this team is going to be able to figure it out in the way that they want by the end of the year, mostly because I'm just so low on one lane in particular. I think the rest of this team is honestly fine in terms of what they are moving forward, but there are real concerns with G2, and I'm not going to let a best of 1 and best of 3 tournament that takes place right after another one completely convince me that every problem that they've had all year long is just suddenly gone. I need to see a lot more of G2 before I believe that. So let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like Broken Blade in the top lane, Skewmond in the jungle, Caps in the mid lane, Hansama at AD carry, and Labrav at support. First and foremost, I'm going to be pretty negative and critical of the team in this breakdown. They are the first team that we've talked about where I firmly believe that if they won the league, I wouldn't be shocked even a little bit. Like, I want to make that clear at the start of this. G2's upside, and quite frankly, what they should be, is a team that should dominate the LEC and win it once again. There is no reason for them not to be there, but I am going to talk about the problems that this team has and the things that have been standing in their way from being there already across this year, and why I believe that they are going to continue to struggle with this moving forward. And, you know, again, like, I don't want it to seem like I'm all out on G2. They're top 3 for a reason, and I believe that the difference between 1, 2, and 3 in these rankings is completely small. Fnatic is in there as well, but they are clearly number 4 for me. If you had G2 at number 1, I'm not going to argue all that much. That being said, let's get into the good and the bad that comes along with this team. Starting with Caps, who still is going to come in as my number 1 mid laner. As much as there is some ups and downs going on around G2, Caps is still Caps, and we still see glimpses of the Caps we know there. Now, is he as good as he was last year? Definitely not. I firmly believe that he has been playing significantly worse than he was in 2024. I also believe he's probably worse right now than he was a couple of years ago as well. Like, you know, I'm not going to say it's the worst Caps has ever been because that makes it seem like he's been bad, but it's certainly the closest I've ever been to taking him out of the number 1 spot in the mid lane rankings in terms of just where he's at. When this team needed him most in the LEC finals, he was terrible. Like, he was the worst player on the team in the LEC finals. And then he goes to MSI, and he's very good at MSI. He's, as far as I know, he was pretty good at the EWC. I haven't watched the tournament. You guys know I'm not concerning myself with the EWC. But again, like, it's best of 3. Like, who cares? Like, genuinely, it's a regular season matchup. So, but for G2, you know, kind of talking about, like, everything that's been going on with them, like, Caps is just one of those players that needs a bit more support around him in order to feel like a superstar. And that's not to say he can't elevate a team. He absolutely can, but his playstyle is really best served at being like the second option on a team. And when he has to be that number 1 guy who carries every single game, sometimes it can just get a bit too much for Caps. And I understand that. Like, I think that there are a lot of players like that. I think Bjergsen was like that for a very long time on TSM for many years. Again, Caps I think is better than Bjergsen in terms of just the way that he functions, and I think he's more talented, but I think that there is something in there where it's like, well, can someone else please just start getting a little bit more consistent? If he has to 1v9 every single game, it's not really going to be working out for this G2 team. But let it be known, I have no qualms with Caps. I think he is, you know, a little bit weaker now than maybe he was last year, but he's still the number 1 mid laner and arguably still the best player in the entire league. It's everything else that's really in flux for me. Starting with the top side here, Broken Blade still coming in as my number 2 top laner. Boy, does he have to really prove that spot. Not only was he terrible at MSI, because I think it's really fair to point out that he was terrible at MSI, he was super inconsistent domestically. I was already kind of talking going into MSI, like before he played any games there, like, hey, watch out for Broken Blade to be sneaky bad at this tournament with the form that he's in. Quite frankly, we are looking at pre-G2 Broken Blade right now. You want to talk about Schalke Broken Blade, you want to talk about TSM Broken Blade, that's the version of him that we are getting on G2 this year, and that's just not good enough. He's dying randomly in side lanes for basically no reason. He's super susceptible to ganks. He's not playing secure. He's very bad on weak side. If he gets resources, he can do things with them, but he kind of requires resources in the way that he's playing right now. I just need to see that calm and patient version of BB that he really developed into on this roster come back. It feels like he's taken the onus on himself to be this big hyper carry, but as we know from his previous stints, the more aggressive he plays, the worse his performance ends up getting. The calm and collected version of Broken Blade is what turned him into one of the best top laners in European history. He needs to get back to that. He needs to start playing a lot more controlled, because from a mechanical perspective, we know he can carry, but he's just too volatile in the state that he's in right now to be considered number 1. He wasn't even in consideration, to be quite frank. Number 2 is pretty generous in terms of the way that he's played, but I just can't rank him below that because of the track record that he has as a player. Then you have Skewmond in the jungle. Boy, is it hard to rank Skewmond because, again, very one-dimensional, very singular style, but like in him versus Razork, it's a very interesting conversation in terms of who you want at number 3. I think top 2 for me feel pretty locked just in terms of how confident I feel in those players, but if you wanted Skewmond at number 3, the argument I would say over Razork would be, well, Skewmond is way more stable at teamfighting than Razork is. He doesn't need to get these leads early. He's a lot less volatile and a lot less dependent on what happens pre-15, because Skewmond as a player really benefits from being able to control space and play out a lot of these objective team fights 5v5 in the back half of games. Things like Maokai have obviously been unstoppable for G2. It's the one champion that has consistently allowed this team to play the style that they want to play. But even on top of that, things like Wukong, you know, things like Sejuani, those are the things you want to see Skewmond play. When he starts to diverge into things like Xin Zhao and Vi and even Nefiri or these more aggressive carry picks, everything falls apart for G2. He just can't be the guy that picks up a lot of those more skirmish, aggressive-oriented to junglers. If he's going to stay patient and play for the back half of games, he can still be very good in that role. And in fact, he was incredible in that role when he was playing in the regular season for G2. And even when he got to play that internationally, he was fine there. It's just everything else where it looks like he is just not a competent international player. I think he can grow into that again. MSI was his first ever international tournament. There is a very real possibility that he just, had some nerves or, wasn't quite ready for the stage and that he will be by the time Worlds comes around. I actually have quite a bit of faith in Skewmont as the player. He just has a playstyle, and you do have to kind of get used to that if you're a G2 fan. But really where all the negativity and the reason I just can't put this team in the top 2 comes in is this bot lane, which I think is cooked. Like, I don't see this as an upper tier bot lane in the LEC. I have them both coming in at 5th. That's where I had them coming into spring, and I think all they've done is reassert that. Honestly, that take has looked awesome over the course of the rest of this year. Hansama continuously dominates domestic playoffs. Good for him. He always steps up in the best of 5s in the LEC. He's terrible internationally. He was awful at MSI. He's been terrible internationally ever since he joined G2. It's been a big problem for him. Really since the Rogue days, he's never been the kind of player that you expect to show up, which is crazy considering the Misfits and Rogue era of Hansama. But at this point, he's also not even really all that good at the thing he was really great at for so many years, which was 2v2 lane dominance. And I get that part of that is that he doesn't have synergy with Labrov. Hans is, of course, that early game, skirmish-oriented kind of player. You have to ban Draven and Callista and Caitlyn and all of this stuff against him. And Labrov is probably the best team fighter out of the support position, but is not very good early and is not great at skirmishing. And so their styles clash heavy, but at the same time, Hans has also regressed really heavily in terms of his ability to stay neutral in 2v2s. Do I think he's fine at that domestically? Yes. Do I think he got exploited in lane internationally? Also, yes. I don't think he has the upside to be a top tier AD carry at this level anymore, and especially with how good ADC is in Europe, I just can't justify putting him higher than number 5. If you want him higher than Noah, sure, go ahead. But if Noah was on this team, genuinely, I would like it a ton better. I would think that they were a lot stronger because of the upside that Noah potentially offers. I'm just so out on the gameplay of Hansama. At MSI, I will say it, this is a very unpopular opinion. Hans was their worst player at MSI. He was completely unplayable in terms of the way he was playing the game. I know a lot of blame fell on Labrov. And while I agree, Labrov was not good at MSI, he doesn't project to be good moving forward. I understand the criticism. The true problem is that they signed a support who's known for his team fighting, who's known for his macro and known for late game playmaking opportunities, and then asked him to be this number 1 skirmish-oriented player in the mid game. He's just not good at that. They've taken a player and completely stripped him away of everything that he's good at, asked him to do exclusively things that he's bad at, and then yelled at him for being bad at it. I get that the expectation for G2 is that you can do everything, but not everybody's Mickey X, and this team made the wrong decision, let's be honest, replacing Mickey with Labrov, and it turns out that was a huge mistake for G2 because they're just significantly worse off for doing it. I don't think Labrov's performances are going to get better because they keep asking him to do things he's not good at, and if they keep doing that, he's going to continue to be bad. He does not come inside the top 4 supports. I still think he's number 5 because I think on a different team, perhaps we could still see a top 1 or a top 2 kind of support performance from Labrov, but again, with what they ask him to do on this team, he's just terrible at setting tempo in the mid game and being the one to play around caps. He's not the kind of player who should be doing that. Skewmont is a lot slower, Labrov is a lot slower, but Hansama and Broken Blade feel like they want to keep their foot on the gas 24/7 right now. G2 has a complete identity crisis. They have yet to figure out who they are, and I have to imagine that if they do figure that out, their performances will improve. That's why I'm saying they're the first team here that I wouldn't be surprised at all if they won the league, but they have to figure things out. If they do, they're favorites to win the LEC, and they're going to be Titans internationally again. If they don't, they might be a team that barely scrapes their way into an international performance. Then moving on now to number 2 in my power rankings, and this is where things get quite spicy in terms of my takes and my opinions, because controversially, coming in at number 2 for me, it will be our defending champions. It will be Movistar KOI, the number 1 seed, obviously, for the LEC at MSI and at EWC, at all the international tournaments that have been happening over the past couple of weeks. I have them at number 2, and I have the team that they beat in those finals, and that also represented the region at number 3, so it certainly does create some interesting conversations, but I think there are just too many holes in KOI's game for me to feel like they are top 1 still right now. I expect more regression out of this team, and honestly, if I was being more true to myself and what I believe, this team might be at number 3, in terms of just how my projections are, because I just don't know if KOI is going to give us what they gave us in the spring split. Again, I think this team is still incredibly volatile. I think there is an opportunity and a chance for them to still be incredible, and there's also a chance that they are just kind of a little bit more like what they were for most of spring, spring and basically all of winter, which was the 4th best team in the LEC. So there are some things to like, some things to be concerned about. Let's talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Mirwin in the top lane, Elyoya in the jungle, Jojo Pune in the mid lane, Supa at AD carry, and Alvaro at support. Really, this entire structure and this entire conversation is structured around the mid-jungle duo, because that's what KOI, I don't want to say is, because that's unfair to the rest of the team. Supa and Alvaro are incredible. They're very strong as a bot lane duo, and they can be a #1 kind of lane on a team that wants to step up and be top 1 or top 2. You know, Supa showed that in their playoff run where he was absolutely terrific, but this team lives and dies by how the jungle mid performs, because you can believe that the bot lane's going to be fine, and you can kind of understand that Mirwin is going to be super feast or famine, that there are going to be good games and bad games coming out of him as a player. But if Elyoya and Jojo are on, if they're playing like a top 1 or a top 2 mid-jungle duo in the league, this team should be #1. That is the difference maker, right? But when they're not, which they don't at a lot of given times, this team ends up being significantly worse. I talked about this a lot in the regular season. When Jojo Pune stepped up and won games for this team, KOI was basically unbeatable, like actually just like unstoppable. Even when like he would go neutral, when this team was up in gold at 15 minutes, I don't know how teams would come back and beat them because of how secure the late game was coming in from players like Supa, Alvaro, and Elyoya around Jojo, but it wasn't happening all the time. If Jojo wasn't winning in the mid lane, not only is he a bad weak side player, he's not somebody who really is good in side lanes and wants to make sure that, you know, he's at a point in the game where he's, you know, going to be able to fight constantly because he's going to be looking for a lot of these exchanges, but also KOI didn't feel like they had the right mentality around playing around anyone else. Supa felt a lot more comfortable when he was playing secondary carries, when he wasn't on these hyper carries, even though he is still very good at those. I want to make that clear. Like, he has the mechanics to perform that. I just don't think KOI played around it well. And I think specifically Elyoya looked a lot more lost when he couldn't play towards the mid lane, and that's just a game plan thing, and that's something I really hope they end up fixing. It was a bit of a problem for them internationally. We saw it against the Flying Oysters, where they just weren't good enough at being able to play through bot lane to exploit any sort of advantage down there, not because, again, Supa and Alvaro are bad, but rather because the game plan's not good enough, and that falls on Elyoya, and that falls on Jojo. That being said, how can I rank Jojo anything other than a top 3 mid laner, because the upside of him is top 1. Any given day, he can be the #1 player in the LEC. We have seen that over and over again. When he wins harder than basically anyone else, but I do think it's a bit more inconsistent, and he just needs to lock it in a tad bit more for me to feel comfortable about it. Elyoya is still going to come in as my #2 jungler. I just think that consistency, even though it's kind of negative in terms of how it plays around the rest of this team, it's got to be ranked above Razork and Skewmont in terms of the consistency that he offers, not only because he's been doing this for many years before and he's been able to figure it out playing through other lanes besides mid lane, but I think even more on top of that, the best parts of what we've seen out of Elyoya are playing for everyone and playing for himself. He can really be that X Factor type of jungler. For many years, I called him the #1 jungler in the LEC, and he still can be that. But right now, I just can't, with good faith, like put him at #1 in my rankings, despite the fact that I imagine a lot of other people will put him up at that #1 spot. So that's the Elyoya Jojo Pune conversation. They matter the most to this team of absolutely anybody on the roster. But Supa and Alvaro, like I said, are still very good. Supa is a very versatile AD carry, kind of your jack of all trades type of ADC that can do a little bit of everything. Is going to be good early, is going to be good late. You're not going to have to worry about him too much. I do worry if he can be the #1 option on a team that wants to dominate, but he kind of was in the playoffs, and it ended up working out really well for this team, and so I have no qualms with Supa. You guys know I gave him Rookie of the Year last year. I'm the highest Supa defender. I was defending him so much in 2024. No concerns there. Alvaro is the playmaker for KOI. I would argue he's the best player on this team, and I don't think many people are going to push back on that. He is just hyper consistent in a team that is not consistent at all, especially a top side of the map that has its problems. Alvaro, every single game, you just know he's going to do the right thing. You just know he's going to be in the right spot, and you know he's going to make the big play, and that's the big thing, right? His big moment instincts are gigantic. He is constantly looking for ways to get back in even when his team is losing in gold. He really is an elite support. He's right there behind Mickey X. 1A and 1B in terms of the supports in the LEC right now in my rankings, at least in my opinion. And then it really comes down to the top side of the map. Mirwin's still going to come in as my #6 top laner because boy, this guy loses a lot for being on a good team. Like, it just kind of is the way that it is. I like Mirwin as a player. I've grown on him a bit, but the consistency is never going to be there. We know who he is. Honestly, people don't want to hear like the kind of, comp that I have for a player like Mirwin, but does this not remind you of a different Mad Lions top laner where he was not the best player of all time, but the team was good enough to be able to elevate around other players? I'm not saying he's Armut, because I think that the conversation around Armut is entirely different. He truly was Narmut, like almost a one trick, and he would have never survived in Fearless, but Mirwin is kind of like a one trick playstyle player where if he's playing regular top laners, he's a bottom 4 top laner in the LEC. I'm not saying he's bottom 1, but he's not top 5 or anything like that. And if he's playing his off meta picks, he can beat the best players in the world. Like, it just kind of is the way that it is with Mirwin. It's hard to get a real wrap on him, but he's proven beyond a shadow of a doubt at this point. He's never going to be good at the meta top laners, and the matchups that every other top laner is comfortable with, he's just not as good in those as a lot of the best ones. So I don't really want to rate him as one of the best ones. I still think he can be a top 4 top laner on he can be a top 1 top laner on any given day, like in the right matchup, picking Smolder or Varus or Vex or whatever on the top side, whatever crazy counter pick he wants to go for. But if teams are prepared for it, and if he is kind of locked into playing, Sion and Cassante and Mbessa and Rumble, like he's just not as good at these champions as everybody else at the top of the standings, which is also a concern. And so you're looking at this team with a lot of question marks, and you're wondering, man, how did they win the spring split? It's because when all of it comes together, when JoJo's playing out of his mind, like a top 1 player, because he has the mechanics to do that, when Elyoya is facilitating everyone, and when Supa and Alvaro are stepping up and Supa's carrying games in the back half, Mirwin is good enough on the top side, KOI is the best team in the league when all of those things end up coming together. And if it happens more consistently for them, by all means, win the league. Like, that would be awesome. I like this KOI roster. The problem is I just worry about their consistency. And so if you want them at number 3, I kind of understand that. If you want them at number 1, I also kind of understand that. Very similar to G2, this team's upside is winning the league and being able to really represent this region internationally if everything is figured out, and their bottom half is like, okay, well, hope you make Worlds. And so with that range, it's just hard to pinpoint down where they're going to land. But that's going to bring us to our final team of the video, number 1 in my power rankings, and probably a bit of a surprise for quite a few people. It's going to be Karmine Corp coming in at number 1. K-Corp is still taking that number 1 spot in my power rankings, and they did not look it in the playoffs. Let's be honest. This team did not look like a team that was going to be top 3. They had their shot. They faced KOI twice in the playoffs and ended up losing to them twice in the playoffs. But really, at the end of the day, that felt like the best possible version of KOI and one of the weaker possible versions of K-Corp, and it still was incredibly close. Call me delusional, call me Delulu, but on paper, this team absolutely should be the best in the league, and if they are not, I think that that is an entirely separate conversation about how disappointing they have been, because really, there's no reason from a talent perspective for them not to be the best team in the LEC, with it being so wide open, with teams like KOI and G2 and Fnatic having so many flaws and so many holes for this team who essentially has been so consistent throughout all of this year. For them to not be at the top, that is unacceptable. They need to get there, and this is the kind of pressure that I think they should be put under. They are number 1 or bust in terms of how this should go moving forward, at least from my perspective. With the way that this roster is constructed, that is just all I can see from my expectations for them. So let's go ahead and go over why. Their lineup is looking like Kana in the top lane, Yike in the jungle, Vladi in the mid lane, Kalist at AD carry, and Targamas at support. There's really not a lot of negatives to talk about here. This team is super strong individually across the board, so much so that you have 3 of the number 1 players in their own roles here, one of which is being promoted up there in the bot lane, but we'll just go top to support in this case because I think that's the easiest way to talk about K-Corp rather than any other direction, because we get to start with Kana, who is, for my money, and this is probably not a hot take at all, but maybe it is, I don't know. Let me know down in the comments how you feel about this. Kana's the best player in the LEC right now. I'll say it is close, right? Like, Caps is right there in terms of the kind of production he can offer, and I think there were times where there were players from KOI who were kind of in that structure, but really, like, when you look at this whole year, no one is doing it like Kana is right now for K-Corp. I really do believe that he is obliterating Europe in terms of the way that he has stepped up, and he is the number 1 option on this team. They want to play for him as strong side top lane, and he is the reason this team is coming in at number 1. When you have a player like Kana, who's an import performing the way that he is right now, it's number 1 or nothing. Like, you can't have this kind of guy in the top lane and not be pushing to win the league. He's too good to not be in that conversation. And, it's really cool to see that, because there were times when he joined this team last year where he had his own set of problems. I think 2025, he's really felt comfortable in Europe. It's clear he's kind of settled into the region, and now he's performing the best we've maybe ever seen him. And this is a guy who formerly played for T1. So you feel pretty good about having a guy like Kana on the top side, whether it's on carries or on tanks. He takes over the game no matter what. He can dominate in lane, get big leads because he gets resources from his team, or he can just play for team fights and still be the best team fighting top laner in the league. No question is he the number 1 top laner, in my opinion. Right now, he's the number 1 player in the LEC. And then Yike in the jungle, still coming in as my number 1 jungler. I get that there's some Yike fatigue because there were times in the best of 5s where he was feast or famine. Well, look at the competition, man. You got Elyoya, Razork, and Skumond breathing down his neck. If being feast or famine was going to disqualify you for being number 1, there would not be a number 1 jungler in the LEC. It just kind of is the way that it is. I think Yike has flaws as a player. I think that there are a lot of concerns with whether or not he can play these super aggressive but also kind of squishy champions that have been more, common in the meta. The Vi is obviously the one that springs to everyone's mind, but things like Xinjiao have also not been perfect for K Corp, but I think he's gotten a lot better in those circumstances, and also I don't think it's a playstyle problem. I think it's a mental problem. I think it's really K Corp failing to play around it in the correct way. I think Yike is fine in that role, and honestly, he can do a bit of everything. He's very versatile. He's not one-dimensional like a lot of the other junglers that we've talked about in this role. I just still really value Yike, and he's still going to come in as my number 1 jungler here. Vladi had his own sets of problems. Honestly, Vladi kind of got his mental destroyed a bit at first stand. I think that it was pretty clear that going into that tournament, he had a lot of expectation on himself. You could argue he was one of the weaker players at that tournament. I would certainly do that. I think he was, from my perspective, the worst player at that tournament outside of Impact, but Vladi never really, fully recovered into becoming the star. He still was very good, I would say, throughout a lot of the spring split, and people were putting him first team All-Pro. Never really felt like K-Corp really relied on him in the same kind of way, though. He just was stable. His numbers were good, his laning was very good, but then you saw it again in the playoffs. You get to these best of 5s, and the yips are kind of there in terms of him just not being as good as Jojo Pune in terms of how he played against KOI in that series. He needed to be better than him, and he just wasn't. If that's going to be the case, if he's going to be closer to 3 or 4, that's what makes things a bit more interesting in terms of these other teams moving up and taking K-Corp's spot, but you have to imagine that Vladi, who was an incredibly stable player before first stand, will figure things out and be able to raise that floor again. That's what I liked so much about him, is that, he was kind of, I know people don't like this comparison because this player has kind of damaged his reputation in recent years, but he was kind of what Larson was for rogue teams for a very long time. Someone you knew would be fine in the mid lane, generate their own lead, and then be super useful no matter the game plan going into the later game. Obviously, Larson, not that player anymore, but I'm talking, league winning Larson. That's the Vladi that I compared, that I had a comparison for, but he just has not been that, in my opinion, over the past couple of months. Hopefully he can get back there. I believe he can, which is why I still have him as number 2 in my mid lane rankings. And then a bot lane that I think you can make a strong argument is the best in the entire league. Kalist is going to come in as my number 180 carry. A lot of people were hyping this guy up at the beginning of the year, and I was like, I think he still has a ways to go before he's a top 280 carry from day number 1. Oops, I was wrong. And I'm happy to admit that, and I admitted that already many times this year. I'm happy to be wrong, and especially if a player is way better than I'm expecting. That's the best kind of wrong, because I want to see players succeed, but boy was I wrong about Kalist, because from day 1, he was one of the best 80 carries in Europe, and at this point, he's continued to grow. He's such an integral part of why this team found success in the regular season. If he can step up and just be the kind of guy that can be their big moments player, which he has shown he's capable of doing at different levels in the past. He was a super clutch player for K-Corp down in the LFL for a very long time. If he can bring that to the tier 1 stage in these big moments, man, he could be the best player in the entire league by the end of the year, and I'm not going to be all that surprised. The mechanics are already there. He's already the most mechanically talented AD carry. I don't even think that's debatable. There's no ADC who can do what Kalist can do in and out of lane. I think it's an all-around skill set. It's really just about making sure you can get it out of him in the big moments, and that's more so the rest of the team's problem. I'm fully in on Kalist. He's my number 180 carry, and I think he's an absolute menace here for K-Corp. And then for Targamas, it looks disappointing. It looks kind of rude to put him at number 4, but again, recall the players that have been above him. They're just players who are playing basically as well as Targamas. They just have a better track record. There's really no major difference between number 1 and number 4. I mean, Mickey X is number 1 for me, but Alvaro, even Jun, who I know I'm crazy high on. I know nobody else is putting Jun above Targamas, but those 4 players are the 4 best supports in the league. Whatever order you want them in, go ahead. I'm certainly not going to complain all that much in terms of that. If you want Targamas at number 2, hell, even number 1, I do kind of understand that. I think he functionally showcases more of a number 2 kind of ranking. I just don't know which player he's inherently going to be better than. But him and Kalist are excellent as a duo. They clearly play off of each other fantastically. Targamas has completely turned his career back around, playing with Kalist. He's had his ups and downs, man. This guy was the worst player in the league last year, and he was probably the worst player in the league the year before that as well, but he's been given opportunity after opportunity because Kalist likes him and wanted to play with him as a duo, and it's very much worked out for this K-Corp team. I think specifically as an engaged support, he's looked really good on those engaged tanks, things like Nautilus and Leona, much more so than a lot of the other players maybe outside of Alvaro at this level. So for K-Corp, I just feel like their roster on paper should be the best in the league. And if they're not, I think that's a problem of K-Corp. Genuinely, when I look at these rosters and when I look at KOI, who beat them twice in the playoffs, when I look at G2, who was kind of always favorited over them, regardless of the fact that, you know, K-Corp was better than them in both winter and in spring. Like, all of this stuff coming together, right? When you look at all of these events, K-Corp still should be better. Like, they should be able to figure it out. This team at their best is easily #1 in the LEC, much more so even than G2 and KOI, in my opinion. Their floor is definitely still there. There's a reason they ended 3rd in the playoffs and that they couldn't get over the hump. But if they can just get out of their own way and allow the talent to come through, this absolutely should be a team hoisting the trophy by the end of the year. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC Summer Split Primer and Power Rankings video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'm sure you disagree with my rankings. I'm excited for you to disagree with my rankings, as I always am on this channel. A lot of people are like, you're so stupid, why would you post this video? Your opinions are so bad. I think people don't understand that I genuinely enjoy the discourse, that I'm not afraid of stating my opinion and, you know, talking about things where I differ. I'm not going to change just to be the same as every other analyst that you see on YouTube or on Twitch or anything like that. They're all well and good, and I'm glad that they're doing their thing, and I'm happy to disagree, and they might be right, I might be right. You know, I'm just excited to see the LEC. I'm excited to get back into LEC action. This is the final primer that we're making for the Summer Split, the final primer of the year before going into Worlds, which is really, really cool. So excited to get into this Summer Split proper, but I hope you guys enjoyed as well. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We cover every single game that the LEC plays throughout the entirety of the year, so we'll be covering this big new format, the playoffs, the regular season, all of that. We also cover all 3 of the other major regions, so LTA North, LCK, and LPL. I have been casting for LPL English as well. Links to that will be down in the description below. If you're interested in checking out that channel, which obviously please go check it out. My next cast, I believe, is August 8th, the morning of August 8th, so if you're curious, come swing by. Again, the YouTube and Twitch links will be in the description for that. I'm also covering the NACL Tier 2 over in North America. We got so much going on here. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when all of those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all